Have you let it get you yet? People ever saying, how bad's it gonna get? And I've been calling to the sky, please don't let more bullets fly. Have you heard the talk of the cities and the towns? There's a fear from the inside and the toil all around. And I've been hoping for my help, find the cure to come and sail. In these times of struggle, you can hear the children cry. Hello, I'm weary. These are
What's up, critical thinkers? Thanks for tuning in. So before I get on a roll tonight, I'm going to play you a song that reminds me how I feel sometimes, just thinking and looking for direction. So here is my interpretation of Shine by Collective Soul. Give me a word and give me a sign. Show me where to look and tell me what I will find. What I will find. Lay me on the ground and fly me in the sky and show me where to look and tell me what will I find. What will I find? Heaven, let your light shine down. Whoa, truth, let your light shine down. Whoa, justice, let your light shine down. Whoa, love and let your light shine down. Love is in the water, love is in the air. Show me where to love and tell me, will love be there? Will love be there? Teach me how to speak and teach me how to share. Teach me where to go and tell me, will love be there? Will love be there? Whoa, knowledge, let your light shine down. Whoa, truth, let your light shine down. Whoa, justice, let your light shine down. Whoa, love and let your light shine down. Give me a word and give me a sign. Show me where to look and tell me what I will find. What I will find. Lay me on the ground and fly me in the sky and show me where to look and tell me what I will find. What will I find? Oh, knowledge, let your light shine down. Heaven, let your light shine down. Whoa, whoa, justice, let your light shine down. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine. Heaven, little light's gonna shine on me. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine. Justice, little light's gonna set me free. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine. Heaven's little light's gonna shine on me. Thank you. Well, so much for Shine by Collective Soul. So I do apologize. I've been told that I sound sometimes like toads croaking in a metal box, so I sure hope that wasn't too hard on anybody's ears. Again, this is Critical Mass TV. I am Brad Hartley, And I could not be here without Jim Kelty, Arthur Hines, and the wonderful VCAM studio in Burlington, Vermont. It is Sunday, April 27th, and tonight we are tackling supposed free trade and its latest undead creations, the TPP and the TPIT. And just those acronyms, I mean, holy shit, let's flush them. There has never been a better time to practice some mixed mental arts for intellectual self-defense. So as we speak, President Obama is pressing the flesh in Asia, trying to inject some energy into a flagging corporatist grab bag that is unbelievably actually losing some steam. Let's first watch a video for some context, and then we'll dive right into a brief history of global trade. And again, as always, my purpose for being here is to be a proponent for resistance, to help generate broader discussions on topics like climate, energy, consumption, hierarchy, and perpetual war for profit. Neoliberal corporate capitalism is the driver out of control, and supposed free trade are the new rules of the road. So, Jim, can you roll that first video for me, please?
This is a story about peril in the Pacific. It's the story about a new U.S.-sponsored trade agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. "11 countries are now engaged in TPP negotiations. The United States, Canada, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam. Japan is also considering joining the talks, and other Pacific Rim countries may participate in the future." The U.S. model for the Trans-Pacific trade deal needs to be completely remade, top to bottom. Friends of the Earth is calling for a fair deal for people and the planet, or no deal at all. An obsessive secrecy surrounds the negotiations. The public, the press, and even members of the U.S. Congress are denied access to the negotiating text. What are they hiding? First, that the TPP is being written under the supervision of multinational corporations. The TPP text is secret to all except so-called cleared advisors. In the United States, there are over 600 such cleared trade advisors, almost all of whom represent corporations or industry groups. Second, they are hiding the fact that the TPP is not so much about trade as it is about deregulating the Pacific economy, providing super rights to corporations. On the morning of Wednesday, June 13, 2012, the TPP investment chapter was leaked. The investment chapter is perhaps the most important and the most dangerous section of the whole agreement. The leaked text put authority over environmental and climate policy into the hands of business-friendly international tribunals, many of them convened by the World Bank in Washington, D.C.
And so what do the corporations affected do? They run to these international trade courts and try to become more powerful than governments themselves. They try to essentially replace democracy and public policy with the rules that the corporations write. Corporations would like to just fight these battles with high-priced lawyers in closed rooms in Washington, D.C.
The investment chapter would have dangerous implications for the environment. A similar provision of the U.S.-Ecuador bilateral investment treaty allowed the oil giant Chevron to sue the government of Ecuador.
In the mid-1960s, Texaco, which is now Chevron, developed the oil fields in the eastern Ecuadorian Amazon. The indigenous and local people who live in this area say that Texaco deliberately dumped billions of gallons of toxic wastewaters, drilling muds, and oil into their environment, causing a social, cultural, and environmental crisis.
Chevron es culpable. Chevron ha destruido todo lo que es nuestra riqueza natural.
This area was a pristine rainforest, one of the most ecologically diverse places on the planet, and the homeland to many indigenous cultures. But after Texaco arrived, it became a tropical wasteland. Literally, they would drill for oil and dump the formation waters, the drilling muds. They would just dump them into unlined waste pits, hundreds of unlined waste pits, Olympic-sized pool unlined waste pits. And of course, because it's a rainforest, these waste pits would overflow into rivers and streams, causing what experts say is a rainforest Chernobyl.
The indigenous people and poor settlers of the Oriente region suffered an epidemic of cancer and other illnesses they say resulted from Texaco's dumping. Death, miscarriages, and birth defects cut a swath through communities, threatening some indigenous groups with extinction. The destruction of the Ecuadorian rainforest, with its world-class biodiversity, was also devastating. This rainforest Chernobyl affected an area the size of Rhode Island, and a court-appointed independent expert in Ecuador found that the damages from the dumping amounted to $27 billion. Indigenous groups and communities sought justice through the courts, and after 18 years of litigation, a provincial court in Ecuador ruled in favor of the communities, ordering Chevron to pay $18 billion. But on February 17, 2012, an international tribunal established under the U.S.-Ecuador Bilateral Investment Treaty put all that in jeopardy. The tribunal told the president, the parliament, and the courts of Ecuador to suspend enforcing the judgment against Chevron.
People around the world, wherever I travel, are dismayed by the Chevron Tribunal's actions. But the underlying problem is the flawed model for U.S. bilateral investment treaties and investment chapters in free trade agreements. The U.S.-Ecuador bilateral investment treaty is typical because it favors the profits of big oil companies, mining multinationals, and the wealthy.
So why is it that the people that have suffered the most, the local and indigenous populations, why is it that they don't have a voice at the International Investment Tribunal? Why is it that U.S. policy favors financial interests and big corporate interests like those of Chevron over those of the people or the environment?
The overreaching of the Chevron Tribunal should be a warning to negotiators from the United States and other Pacific countries as they meet in coming months to fashion a Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement.
The investment chapter of the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership would in effect create a separate court for capital. Now, the arbitrators or the judges in these tribunals are typically international commercial lawyers who may one day serve as independent, quote-unquote, arbitrators, and then on the next day return as corporate counsel. The other thing is that most arbitrators are actually from the United States and Western Europe, while most of the defendants are from the Global South. And so I call this a kangaroo court.
The TPP investment chapter would provide greater rights for foreign investors. These super rights for big oil, big pharma, and Wall Street investors go far beyond domestic constitutional protections of property rights and due process in the United States. In fact, the U.S. already favors property rights and corporate rights far greater than almost every other country in the world.
The worst thing about the proposed TPP investment chapter is that it would likely result in crippling awards of money damages against developing countries. Now, developing countries, some of them face billions in liability. And just the fear of such ruinous judgments will force countries to settle investor claims, even the ones that are unjust. Worse, countries will actually back away from instituting new legislation and regulations designed to protect the environment, protect public health, and the public interest. Some people call this the chilling effect. I call it the deep freeze, where you have sovereign democracies that will actually be afraid of regulating for the environment and for people. And people power is the way to fight for a fair deal. The people have been demanding a fair deal all around the Pacific Rim. Jesse Jackson and Ben & Jerry spoke out in Chicago. The Peruvian people called for a fair deal. In Australia, environmentalists and trade unionists marched in solidarity. The Japanese called for economic justice. Opposition to corporate power is building in New Zealand. Malaysians are defending their national sovereignty. They are speaking out against an international trade regime that pays polluters rather than making polluters pay. They are speaking out against a system in which property rights trump environmental responsibility. They're speaking out against kangaroo courts making economic policy for the Pacific region and saying that it's time to throw the secret drafts of the Trans-Pacific Partnership into the dustbin.
So, every time I watch a video like that or read an article, it makes me a little bit speechless for a very short time. One thing that strikes me immediately is you're always going to get burned when foxes are guarding the hen house, and how we can let these kind of equations perpetuate forever without more people getting pissed off is just, it's mind-blowing to me. One thing that is really dominant in the United States that is not possibly as dominant elsewhere in the world is the lockdown of corporate media on the whole spectrum of the supposed news that we get every day. We get information from no one but through the filters of very large corporations. I think there's only 6 or 7 primary corporations now that control almost all the print and visual media in the United States. And contrary to popular opinion, they are not liberal institutions. They're some of the most conservative institutions on earth. So much for busting that line of bullshit. Another very important aspect that we haven't talked about yet is I read an article a couple of weeks ago, and so it was, I think it was the first week of April, and it was a documentation of how many times the TPP had been mentioned in the corporate media between July of last year and I think the end of March. There's also TAFTA, was the previous name, but the trade agreement that's also being negotiated and has been being negotiated, I think, for 10 years with the European Union, which is now called the Transatlantic Partnership on Investment and Trade, or it used to be known as TAFTA. So we have the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and TAFTA. This data reflected corporate media, so all the major networks and print media. So how many times had these giant trade agreements, which really are the the codification of how the world's relationship is going to be from here on out, how many times were they mentioned on the nightly news? And the answer in that 6 months, whatever, say 8-month period was one time. They could find, the researchers could find one time that the TPP was mentioned, and it was the public broadcasting system was the only network that actually had even mentioned it, and their spin on it was pretty much entirely positive. They reflected on none of the negative aspects of these trade agreements, and I found that just to be unbelievable. So if you wonder how our thoughts are controlled, that is the perfect evidence for the major mechanism by which our thoughts are controlled and then our behaviors are controlled. There's, you could look in any major city around the U.S., there wouldn't have been more than a half a dozen people lately out doing any sort of active work protesting these trade agreements. So we'll get back to that in a few minutes. I just wanted to go over, I mentioned that we would be delving into globalism, free trade, and trade agreements, the latest of which is such a mind blower that only criminal negligence can explain the fact that we have heard next to nothing about it from our trusted leaders. It's called the TPP or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I'm just going to briefly go over a little history of global trade. Global trade in the modern era has its roots in the demand for luxury goods by aristocratic Europeans. The Roman Empire developed complex systems to bring raw materials, minerals, perishables back to Rome from its far-flung territories. Europe's dynastic kings and their cronies, after feeding on each other for centuries, rediscovered the joy of scarce luxury items, and the Silk Road from the Far East to Europe brought tremendous wealth and fortune until Constantinople was finally conquered in the 15th century. So began the era of the transoceanic merchant fleet and royal navies. The lust for exotic spices, fabrics, and gold was so intense that no population was too big to slaughter, no country too big to invade, and no violence too great to bring even on one's royal competitors from other European nations. Suffice it to say that private companies like the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company even owned and ran countries like India and Indonesia using private armies and extreme force to extract everything they could. The Spanish and Portuguese were also big players and fought each other as well as the East India Company in their world domination quests. There is so much interesting history here that I recommend some research on one's own, but let's sum up this intro to free trade by saying that forcing thousands of tons of Indian opium on the Chinese and the massive international slave trade were all seen as just business as usual by the elites of their day. It is ironic that private wealth controlled the colonies originally, and only when it became expedient for the super rich to build large state armies and navies did they cede this role to government. Another interesting point of history was the opening up of Japan as a trading partner in 1853. Was it Commodore Matthew Perry sailed in with a armed U.S. fleet, of course gunships, and they moored in Tokyo Bay and not only threatened to attack Japan, they bombarded Japan until the feudal lords gave in, and knowing that they were probably going to get conquered, and they opened up Japan to trade in that way. So in 1853, it was brutal military force and threats of extreme violence. You have to remember that a giant multinational corporation now is not that much different than that dynamic. They just use different means, and they're a little bit slicker and more clever about how they go about these trade agreements. But that, between the Indian opium and the Chinese and the opening up of Japan is very, very interesting. So this retelling of early globalism is a nice segue into a discussion of the TPP and the TPIT, or whatever the heck it is, and free trade generally. Of course, free trade is a propaganda term, and this type of trade is the most restrictive on earth. The dollar amounts required to have foreign factories and shipping fleets, not to mention the U.S. military and intelligence services at your beck and call, are prohibitive, to say the least. This highly restrictive free trade is not free and is only possible with massive computerization and huge subsidy from the middle class, who pays most of the bills and buys most of the cheap plastic crap and loses most of the jobs. One of the pillars of neoliberalism, free trade, is seen as essential in the never-ending quest by big business to dominate the world. Fair trade would imply a democratically designed system where people trade goods and services based on what works regionally. Let's explore a bit more the contrast that is free trade. So remember that any reference to what the American people want is the propaganda term for big businesses' needs. These are just some points of interest. The greatest meaningful threat to our national security is being sold out from within by the billionaires and not some tiny external enemy. The intent of free trade agreements is the unfettering of capital, the ability to exploit cheap labor, lax regulation, and corrupt local officials to maximize profits for the mothership. Restrictions on the financial services industry, banks, are eliminated. Import and export duties and tariffs to protect local economies and workers are almost extinct. In all free trade agreements and the TPP doctrine, capital is no longer restricted by political boundaries. It can zip anywhere to increase its exploitive behavior, but political boundaries, the historical boundaries between countries, they are maintained rigidly to keep workers from moving to leverage themselves. That's very important to remember. Money and capital can zip anywhere it wants. Political boundaries and borders are there to keep workers from moving to areas with higher wages. So the wages in industrialized countries are pulled down relentlessly by exposure to virtual slave labor overseas. Speaking of national security, is it good planning to borrow trillions of dollars from totalitarian communist banks and move all one's manufacturing industries to the same totalitarian nation? How dangerous is it to lose millions of high-quality jobs and replace them with what? Minimum wage service jobs? We've mentioned this before, but putting the little guy face on the big business agenda is something that everyone has to be aware of. It's one of the major manipulation techniques that's used to get inside your head and turn it into jelly. So remember the dynamic. Never has so much money been generated annually in this world. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, when Clinton was elected president, had never been over 2,000, if you follow the New York Stock Exchange at all. Now, 15,000 plus 16,000 represents a massive increase in the amount of money that is involved in this, the New York Stock Exchange. Never have corporate profits been this high. Never have there been so many billionaires. Wages for workers are down since 1970, down or flat. Personal debt has never been so high. Foreclosures of homes have never been so high. Student debt is $1 trillion. The federal government actually last year announced that it made $48 billion servicing student loan debt last year, $48 billion in revenue. And frickin' ExxonMobil, making the most of any private corporation in history, last year its reported profits were just 46+ billion. So the TPP is the latest free trade being pushed hard by corporate America, with the entire wish list of the 1% represented. If enacted, it will offshore millions more American jobs. It will free Wall Street from its already marginal oversight. It will ban Buy American and Buy Local policies needed to create green jobs and rebuild our economy. It will decrease access to medicines. It will flood the U.S. with unsafe food and products. It empowers corporations to attack our entire regulatory structure, including environmental, safety, and health regulations. And this is one of the most frightening things, and it was mentioned in this last video. It creates offshore corporate tribunals run by corporate lawyers, only designed to replace political systems and any semblance of local control of the economy. Closed-door, super-secret talks are ongoing between the U.S. and Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam, with others, possibly including China. There's a lot of political shenanigans and chicanery going on about China right now. On the one hand, totally deeply involved in its economy, in debt to it for trillions of dollars from their Chinese national banks, but on the other hand, using it as a political whipping horse, where they instantly, if free trade, if this TPP runs up against the rocks, they are using China kind of as a scapegoat. Well, we need this because we need to counterbalance emerging Chinese power or something, like they've ever attacked. Of course, there's issues with them militarily, but they are incredibly minor compared to some Western nations' shenanigans and Russia. So 600 corporate representatives are doing all of the negotiating for the U.S., while the public, Congress, and investigative journalists are all excluded. And as she mentioned, leaked chapters show unbelievably scary scenarios. Under the TPP, foreign corporations gain unprecedented powers: the rights to buy land, resources, and factories without any review, even strategic review or any kind of security review. All risks and costs of offshoring jobs are eliminated. Special guaranteed preferential treatment for relocating firms are provided. Compensation for loss of expected future profits for any health, labor, or environmental laws that exist or are passed in the future by us. Regulatory takings compensation is what it's called. So let me say that again. Compensation for loss of expected future profits for a company for any health, labor, or environmental laws that exist or are passed in the future. It's called regulatory takings compensation. The rights to move capital without limits enhanced, establishing new rights to cover investment, intellectual property, and permits and derivatives. Ban the concept of corporations' requirement to serve the public interest. No longer is a corporation in its basic charters required to serve the public interest, and remove all references to same. The U.S. multinationals' desire for the TPP is to impose extreme foreign investor privileges and rights, and that's in quotes, and private enforcement through the notorious investor state system. This system elevates private corporations from their status as people to an equal or dominant standing with the countries that sign the TPP. So General Electric or Archer Daniels Midland or whoever would be as powerful legally as the government of Canada, say, or New Zealand. What's next? Absolute corporate takeover and removal of representative governments would be a logical step. They're basically rendered completely impotent by these agreements. Under this regime, foreign investors can skirt domestic courts and laws and sue governments directly before offshore tribunals of 3 corporate lawyers operating under World Bank rules to demand taxpayer compensation for any domestic law that investors feel will reduce their expected future profits. Over $3 billion has been paid to foreign investors under U.S. trade and investment pacts already existing, while over $14 billion in claims are pending under these deals. So this is the World Trade Organization regime now. So $3 billion has already been paid by U.S. By the United States, by civil governments to foreign investors. $3 billion and $14 billion in claims against us are pending under these deals, primarily targeting environmental, energy, and public health laws. So there's another thing that's just absolutely not discussed in the media. So you have to draw your own conclusions there. Are you getting zoomed or what? The TPP nations must open their treasuries. Now listen to that. The TPP signatory nations must open their treasuries to the authority of these corporate tribunals, and cash will be paid from our treasury directly to the corporation. You understand that they will have direct access to the U.S. Treasury. I cannot say that enough. You also understand that corporations now pay next to no income taxes and contribute little to the Treasury. So who frickin' pays? Yeah, it's the middle, muddled class that has no representation and is going to get soaked. So, and just about financial deregulation. Worldwide, the call from responsible people is for more robust regulation of banks and the financial sector after they plunged us into recession with casino-like binging going on for years before 07, 08. A global economic crisis was the result. Under the TPP, all countries will be bound to expansive financial deregulation imposed by the World Trade Organization. These terms lock in the model that responsible analysts consider the prime cause of the latest crisis. Deregulation and the massive gains in power of the financial sector and Wall Street are the most important and least discussed aspects of the WTO, the TPP, and trade agreements generally. We'll have, and politics in general actually also. We'll have to scrutinize this industry and its minions in a future show and explore some realistic alternatives available to us. Another important point is the Stop Online Piracy Act and PIPA. People have thought that net independence and stuff were a battle had been won to protect the internet from takeover. They are back in these trade agreements turbocharged with nothing being available free, everything considered piracy that is used without paying a fee, and even things like open source Linux being banned. Internet service providers will be forced to do a 3 strikes and you're out rule for customers visiting sites, and sites can be permanently banned. There'll be a lot more suing of individual users, taking action against subscribers, and shutting down domains. And as far as internet manipulation, there's a lot you should be researching right now. There's some other big things underway. So the Faustian bargain that is the TPP is a dangerous one, as all deals with fiends must be. The price of service is the wagerer's soul. In dealing with the current crop of corporate devils, all of us are forced into a Faustian bargain in which we end up supporting a wildly greedy and destructive corporate capitalism, partly out of ignorance, but also because of fear. Fear of the work that creating a meaningful alternative will take, fear of fascist influences exerting power into any reconstructive power vacuum, fear of change and fear of losing our soul. So, Jim, we have another video to watch. Can you cue up that second video for me? That would be awesome.
Capitol Hill introduced the Bipartisan Congressional Trade Priorities Act of 2014. The bill gives the White House the power to fast-track international trade agreements, which means that so-called free trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, will be given an up or down vote by Congress without any amendments or debate. If passed, the TPP will send thousands of jobs overseas and do nothing to protect the American economy or people. But there's also a chance that the Trade Priorities Act could make lawmakers more aware of just how bad the TPP is and increase opposition toward that secretive trade deal. So is the TPP a foregone conclusion, or could the Bipartisan Congressional Trade Priorities Act be a blessing in disguise for TPP opponents? Joining me now for more on all of this is Congressman Mark Pocan, representing Wisconsin's 2nd District. Congressman, welcome back.
Yeah, thank you, Tom.
First of all, the title of this act, I don't recall ever seeing the word bipartisan as the first word in the title of an act. And unless I missed something, I think that it's got a Democrat or Republican in the Senate, but in the House, it only has a Republican sponsor. How can they call it bipartisan?
Well, and that really should stand out because we had 151 people, House Democrats, sign, along with 27 House Republicans, a letter opposing fast track prior to this. And the fact that no House Democrats signed on to be a lead sponsor really does stand out that Congress has got some concerns about this.
Yeah, I would think. Now, my understanding is that if this, well, first of all, you describe fast track to us. Tell why does fast track matter to this?
Sure. This basically takes away our ability to amend or have a discussion really about the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. And as we know from NAFTA and all the other trade deals in the past, almost always we'll have a trade surplus before NAFTA. After that, we have a trade deficit with Mexico. Before the Korea Pact, we had a trade surplus, and now that's gone into deficit situation. So it's been bad for jobs, American jobs going overseas. We know that. But this specifically, the fast track would take away our ability to amend it, whether it be on labor standards, environmental standards, food safety, intellectual property, you name it. It's a vast document, and it would take away our ability to make any changes. Congress's ability, and by that means the people's ability, because we're the representatives to make those changes. It would take away our ability to do that. And you know, this is the fact that it's negotiated in secret. Now they want to have it up and down without any kind of debate or amendments. It just should tell you how bad potentially the agreement is.
This is, and I've also heard, just kind of gossip around town, that if this fast track bill passes, and it was dropped last Thursday when it was wall-to-wall Chris Christie. I don't think most people even know it's out there, and it's not called the Fast Track Act. Right. That if this fast track thing passes, then probably TPP will pass because it's a done deal with the Republicans in the House and in the Senate. They'll pull out of both parties enough votes to pass it. So this is really the vote that counts. Do I have that right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, because there could be people who say, you know, I might support the TPP, even though I would definitely argue many reasons why they shouldn't, but they may not want to give away their ability to influence it, to amend it, to have a debate about it. So really, this vote, if it goes down, very likely means the TPP will pass.
Yeah, if this
bill passes, I'm sorry, yes. Yeah. If the fast track passes, very likely TPP could pass. So we need to do everything we're doing. We're working kind of on a separate but equal track. Republicans are working Republicans. Democrats are working Democrats. Just last Friday, Nancy Pelosi had a very, I thought, unusual meeting. Usually we have caucuses, we have whip meetings. This was a special meeting that she convened the meeting, and we talked about the unemployment extension and the fast track, and the fact that it's getting that kind of level discussion with leadership, again, I think is a positive sign for our caucus.
That's a very good sign. One of the big objections to virtually all of these free trade deals is that at some level we're surrendering our national sovereignty. These deals that really should be considered treaties, and they should be ratified by the Senate, but that's a whole other discussion, that these deals are giving foreign, not just foreign governments, but foreign corporations the ability to sue political entities here in the United States, cities, towns, counties, states, the federal government or companies in the United States, and that we can't pass our own laws any longer. Is that true?
Yeah, that's one of the most insidious parts of it, is the fact that a corporation could contest a law that we have in Wisconsin, for example. If we have a Buy American law, which we do, and I passed, it was called the American Jobs Act back when I was a legislator back in Wisconsin, they could supersede and challenge that and win. So your Buy Local laws, Buy American laws, all under the procurement section of the Trans-Pacific Partnership would take away our ability to have those in place. And I've actually seen the language back in August. I got a chance to see 2 of the 20-some sections, the labor and the procurement section, and the language is just as bad as it's always been in that area. And I think that's just one example of what it takes away. It allows a corporation to challenge our laws that are passed by our elected officials.
Right. Now, historically, I mean, you know, from the 20s, actually, with the League of Nations, the conservative argument against the United Nations has been that by signing on with the United Nations, we are giving up our right to unilaterally declare war. In other words, we're surrendering sovereignty in the area of war. Mm-hmm. This is a surrender of sovereignty across the entire economic spectrum. It seems like a much bigger deal. And yet, you know, conservatives and Republicans for 50 years have been hysterical about the United Nations. I don't get it why they're not hysterical about this, A. And B, this fast track is a surrender of the sovereignty of Congress, a surrender of the ability of Congress to even debate a piece of legislation that's coming before them. Aren't both of those things just giant triggers for anybody who's ever had even a whiff of a John Birch Society meeting?
Yes, absolutely.
Not to mention the progressives.
Well, and it allows us to now have these questions about, well, what does this do to our ability to have Buy American laws? What does this do to our ability to have fair labor standards in Vietnam where people make 28 cents an hour? How do you have a treaty that's going to make it at all fair trade? It won't be. It'll just be this free trade. So we can start talking about those things with our colleagues, and I think that's where we're going to find that people are going to say, no, I want to actually see the language. I want to discuss it. I want to debate it. I may want to amend it. And that's what we give up with Fast Track, are the ability to do all of those things.
So if people call their members of Congress and say, I'm opposed to Fast Track, is that enough, or do they need to say, I'm opposed to the Bipartisan Congressional Trade Priorities Act?
I think you can say, I oppose Fast Track, and I'm watching, and I vote this fall.
Yeah, and I vote. Yeah.
Yes.
It makes a big deal.
Yeah.
Congressman Mark Pocan,
Absolutely.
thank you so much.
Thank you,
It's always
Tom.
great to see you.
Absolutely, appreciate it.
So, a little bit more information. One interesting point that he just made, he mentioned progressives and John Bircher Society types, which a lot of people would know now as, you know, the kind of the extreme right, which is a kind of just, you know, not that accurate a term, but say the Alex Jones types and the John Birchers and the extreme libertarian types. We actually, us on the left, and I consider myself pretty much extreme left, bordering on I don't know what, but he was drawing a similarity between the way that the extreme right feels about being sold out, and the left also, which is kind of a weird coming around the circle and meeting in the back. A little bit different reasons, but sovereignty and surrendering of that has a lot to do with it. Okay, so this is a press release from Public Citizen and Lori Wallach at Public Citizen. It's called on the Obama-Abe Summit regarding the TPP. So Washington. Ironically, if missing this do-or-die moment for the TPP seals its demise, then what will be characterized as a failure now may in fact save President Obama's legacy, given that the TPP would cause more American job offshoring, greater income inequality, and higher medicine prices. After years of missed deadlines, unbending opposition by other nations to many U.S. proposals, and scores of deadlocked TPP issues, Congress's refusal to grant President Obama trade authority, growing opposition in many nations, and now Obama and Abe not announcing a breakthrough, TPP should be ready for burial. Instead, like some movie monster that will not die, TPP is being animated by a broad coalition of powerful corporate interests, and we are told talks will continue. Even if the continuing bilateral negotiations resolve U.S.-Japan auto and agricultural trade issues, there are scores of other deep deadlocks in TPP negotiations. This includes deep disputes on medicine patent and government drug reimbursement rate policies that would affect healthcare costs, limits on financial regulations, food safety and internet freedom, disciplines on state-owned enterprises, the expansion of investor protections that subject domestic laws to attack by corporations in foreign tribunals, and environmental and labor standards. As well, 60 U.S. senators and 230 U.S. representatives have insisted that TPP include enforceable disciplines on currency manipulation, but other TPP countries oppose this, and to date the issue had not been addressed. Okay. This is called Corporate Colonialism. Protesters slam TPP, U.S. military 1-2 punch ahead of the Obama visit. Asia Pacific Voices demand U.S. out. By Sarah Lazar, staff writer for Common Dreams. As President Barack Obama prepares to embark on his 5th visit to the Asia Pacific region, grassroots protests against U.S. efforts to ram through the Trans-Pacific trade deal and the U.S. military pivot to Asia are mounting on both sides of the Pacific. People are saying we don't want more U.S. militarization in our countries, said Rhonda Ramiro, vice chair of Bayan USA, an alliance of Filipino organizations in the U.S., in an interview with Common Dreams. This is about U.S. military power and economic domination. In the coming days, protests against the TPP and U.S. military pivot will sweep U.S. embassies in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, with more actions slated for the weeks and months to come, said Ramiro. Channel News Asia reports that in Tokyo, where Obama will land Wednesday, and obviously already has, protests against the TPP by workers, farmers, and community groups are already heating up. Meanwhile, Bayan USA is organizing a day of action on Friday in major cities across the U.S. to oppose military buildup throughout the Philippines and the Asia-Pacific region. And Monday marked the beginning of a U.S. week of action against the TPP, backed by a coalition of environmental, labor, internet freedom, and numerous other organizations. Obama is widely expected to use his upcoming trip to Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, and the Philippines to push for the TPP and secure a U.S. military buildup in the region. Critics charge that this economic and military agenda is part of a broader strategic plan to bolster U.S. geopolitical control of the region and hedge against China. The TPP, which has been referred to as NAFTA on steroids, is a so-called free trade agreement currently under negotiation between those 12 countries previously mentioned. The negotiations have been highly secretive, with the bulk of publicly available information exposed by WikiLeaks. Documents show that negotiators are pushing for inclusion of NAFTA's infamous corporate tribunals, in which corporations settle disputes with governments in secrecy and trample domestic protections from public health, environmental regulations, and completely circumventing their own national legal systems. So I want to very quickly read from the latest Peace and Justice newsletter from the Peace and Justice Center of Vermont. And this is Robin's Nest by Robin Lloyd, Fast Tracking the TPP. Remember that extraordinary confrontation in Seattle when 40,000 protesters in November of 1999 occupied the city and brought the World Trade Organization conference to its knees? Well, now another trade battle is brewing. Are we ready? You've probably heard about it, the TPP, preceded by fast track. Lori Wallach of Public Citizen has a name for the TPP. She calls it NAFTA on steroids. And where did the North American Free Trade Agreement get us? Implemented 20 years ago by the Clinton administration, a recent report says that NAFTA has led to 1 million lost U.S. jobs, higher income inequality, a doubling of immigration from Mexico, larger trade deficits with Mexico and Canada, displacement and instability in Mexico, larger trade deficits, we mentioned that with Canada and Mexico, and corporate attacks on environmental laws. Nevertheless, despite this dismal trade precedent, the Obama administration is putting its big guns behind this new, bigger, better Pacific Rim trade agreement. So why should we care? The TPP region is home to 40% of the world's population, produces nearly 60% of the global GDP, gross domestic product, and includes some of the fastest growing economies in the world, including Canada, Mexico, and Japan. Negotiating partners made up 40% of U.S. goods traded in 2012, and the Asia-Pacific economies as a whole made up over 62%. The TPP would be the largest United States free trade agreement to date by trade value. It is, in short, the dream of the 1%. With 600 U.S. corporations as official advisors, this international agreement has been negotiated behind closed doors over the past 2 years. What would TPP mean for the 99%? Millions more American jobs offshored, backdoor deregulation for deregulation for financial firms, and wrecking the economy again. Floods of unsafe products, higher medicine prices, a ban on Buy America policies needed to create green jobs and rebuild our economy, foreign corporations empowered to attack our environmental and health policies in foreign tribunals. And this is a comment by Senator Patrick Leahy. I've heard from many Vermonters about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, especially about the secrecy surrounding the negotiations and also about the content. I share those concerns about the lack of transparency. And earlier in this process, I made that point in a letter to the U.S. Trade Representative. I also believe there has not been adequate congressional involvement in the process, and I am wary about the effects of the TPP on fair labor practices, the quality of imports, human rights standards, intellectual property rights, and the environment. I generally support free trade because it benefits Vermont and the country as a whole. As a small state, Vermont increasingly relies on exports to fuel our state's economy. But I want a process that is accessible, particularly to individuals and groups representing organized labor. And I believe that parts of the draft agreement should be made public. So that's pretty timid, and I wouldn't expect much more from corporatist Pat. I mean, he definitely has some valid points, but he is as beholden to corporate dollars as anybody you're going to find. So we just have a little bit of time left here. I just want to run through a little editorial here. The structure of the militarized corporatist free trade agenda is the mainstream. In the mainstream is far from neutral. It presupposes positions of political and economic authority brought by the very institutions that have brought us to the brink in the first place. It also reduces to an afterthought the very real consequences being felt worldwide by people living under oily, top-down, violent greed cult rule. So this leads me to tonight's Orwellian afterthought. Why is someone speaking the truth with nothing to gain financially, warning us about serious issues of survival, viewed with suspicion and labeled extremist, while another, standing to profit in the billions, processing away our life support system, is held high on a pedestal, someone to admire and obey? And I am just saying, that's it tonight. Critical Mass TV, I really appreciate you tuning in, and join us next time on Critical Mass TV. Thanks again. See you later. I appreciate it.